Hi, I'm John Petersen, and welcome to PostScript. We come to you on a regular basis from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, where the Arlington Institute sponsors a series called Berkeley Springs Transition Talks. And we bring to our small town here in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia extraordinary kind of speakers from different places in the world who all talk about different aspects of the major transition that's happening in the world today and the emergence of a new world and a new human being for that matter. And our guest today is Steve McDonald. Steve McDonald is a wonderful thinker about the large kind of trends and the processes by which the underlying dynamics about human development and how historically and predictably in the future that new world would emerge and what the characteristics of that would be. Steve's from Australia. He used to fly helicopters for the Army and the Australian Army and spent time in Somalia. Also been a consultant, a business consultant, and has worked about in various areas trying to understand the larger kind of reality and how this all works and where we are going as humans. And Steve, it's awfully nice to have you with us.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you think about this kind of Clair W kind of stuff.
Sure. Well, I guess early on in my Army career, I did some international travel and spent time in Somalia during the conflict there in 1993. And I was amazed to see a society that had actually gone backwards in a developmental sense. The town that I was based in, Baidoa, was really without any government or utilities. It was a very basic place, pretty much like the Wild West. Yet there was a ruined Coca-Cola factory, a ruined Fiat car factory, and an agricultural college in ruins. And it really made me start to think about how could a society that had reached that level of development go backwards to this, And I think from then on I developed a keen interest in particularly the human mind and how the mind works, and a part of that journey was me coming down with post-traumatic stress after my war service. So that sent me on a deep inward journey to try and figure out what's going on and how does this work. And then I eventually ended up working in change as a change management consultant in the corporate sector. And it was then that I discovered the work of Clair W.
Well, tell us a little bit more about Clair W. and what he...
Sure. So Clair W. was a professor of psychology at Union College in Schenectady in upstate New York. And in teaching psychology at that time, and we're talking about the 1950s here, there were about 5 different theories that were covered during his training course, and inevitably at the end of the course one of his students would stand up and say, "Dr. Graves, we've studied all these theories, which one's right?" And that eventually challenged him to do his own research, and he did 9 years of field research, and his research was somewhat unique. Most people when they do academic studies start out with an idea that they want to specifically explore.
Yeah.
And he just started with a question, basically, and the question was, what is the nature of a psychologically mature adult? Mm-hmm. And studied over 1,000 people for 9 years, so he captured not only their concepts around that question, but also how their concepts changed over time. And then he was smart enough not to do all the analysis himself, so he brought together a team of people to help him analyse the patterns in the data. And that analysis went on for many, many years after the field research. And unfortunately, he passed away before he published academically, so his work is not well known. But I kind of think of him as the Einstein of psychology.
Do you know of anybody else who's kind of looked as broadly and deeply as that?
Well, certainly Don Beck and Christopher Cowan worked closely with Graves, I think for about 11 years before he passed away. And then published the book Spiral Dynamics in the late 1990s, which was really the first significant publication that was mostly based on Graves' work.
But there probably weren't any other researchers that you're familiar with broadly that kind of looked as broad, as kind of comprehensively in an integrated kind of systems way?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there have been lots of developmental psychology studies done, And lots of people have come up with similar results where they've mapped out stages of development and the change process. But I haven't seen any body of work that's as comprehensive and as integrated as Graves's work.
So talk a little bit about that, because it's really kind of the basis of how you look at the world and how you see the future and what might be coming, and how you can kind of explain and make sense out of what's going on kind of presently across the planet.
So I guess there were three, in my mind, there were three main things that came out of Graves's work. The first one was he identified this adaptive relationship between the complexity of life conditions that we live within and the response of human consciousness in order to be able to meet the challenges of those life conditions. And as our life conditions become more complex and the problems that we face become more complex, then so our thinking and our behavior becomes more complex to match, so we can cope. That was the first thing.
And that's the evolutionary process.
Yeah, so that, if you can imagine life conditions increasing in complexity and then consciousness responding to that, and that gap between how complex life conditions are and where consciousness is like the evolutionary tension that draws us up the evolutionary tree. So that was the first thing. The second thing was he mapped the change process, in other words, the human experience of change and how that impacts our behavior. And lots of other people have studied that, and I guess one of the most famous philosophers, would be Joseph Campbell, who's done an extensive study of that kind of thing under the title The Hero's Journey.
Right.
And then the third thing was he found that there were discrete stages that we move between as we go up this complexity scale, and within that there are patterns. And it's really the patterns, he was a master of pattern recognition.
Yeah.
And these patterns that he found are extremely useful. One of the most simple ones was that as people progress up the stages, you have this swing between self-expression and self-sacrifice. So a stage based around self-expression means that people think about how they can change their world to fit with their needs. And then on the other side of the pendulum swing, you've got a self-sacrifice where people are driven to change themselves in order to fit with what the world needs.
And there are societies that largely mirror those kinds of dynamics.
Yeah, well, this was the interesting thing, is these patterns seem to apply not just at an individual's level of growth, but also large scale. We can look at societies and we can actually look at the whole evolution of the human species, and it seems to conform with these patterns. Yeah.
So build the system from the bottom up.
Sure. So looking at the stages, Graves originally found, I think, about 6 stages, and as his analysis developed, he realised that there was probably another one down the bottom of the tree that he hadn't found in his field research. And then over time, or during the 9 years, some of the people who were at the highest stage shifted again to another stage. So we ended up mapping 8 altogether. Right. And to run through them just very briefly, the first is like an automatic way of living, which it's a self-expression, so an individualistic stage, which manifests at a species level as like hunter-gatherer society, and at an individual level as life as a small infant, where you're really just totally consumed, existing, breathing, sleeping and eating, simple existence. And from there the pendulum swings to the self-sacrifice or communal side, and we see the emergence of tribal societies. So when in evolutionary sense, when we started to band together into tribes, and we saw an explosion of culture around that time as well. And at an individual level, that equates to family life, where we're growing up into childhood and living in a family unit where there's a clear head of the family and there are customs and taboos within the family and those sorts of things. And then from there, the third stage is an egocentric stage, where we bust out of the confines of that family existence, and we're all familiar with that. As we enter our teens, particularly, where we want independence, we want to have our own power, we want to find out who we are in the world. And I guess at a species level, that equates to the time when we busted out of the tribal boundaries and started moving into other people's lands and dominating other people's lands with power and violence and those sorts of things. And then stage 4 is the first of the rational-minded dominated stages, where historically we saw the emergence of organised agriculture and people moving together to live in large towns and cities and those sorts of things.
Now this isn't just historical, although it is. You can map across all of existing kind of human experience right now in societies and cultural kind of situations into this framework, right?
You can, and it's important to understand that while this is a very complex model, and to explain it, you've kind of got to break it down a little bit into more simplistic terms, but these stages that I'm talking about are actually nested inside each other, so they're kind of like the layers of skin on an onion. Yeah.
And I want you to build it all the way up, but the point I'm trying to make is that this describes how human beings across this planet live right now, universally, how they have lived, and where they, what the kind of the architecture, the framework of the development process, right?
Exactly, yeah. So it's like a filter or a window that we can look through to understand the complexity of different societies, and by understanding which of these stages is their dominating level, we can then start to understand what their motivations are, how they think, how they're likely to organise themselves, and how they're likely to interact with other societies.
So we were coming out of kind of tribal things and working our way into cities and towns.
So we went from like hunter-gatherer to tribal to egocentric and power-dominated, and then into this 4th level where we start to see the emergence of cities and organised large-scale agriculture. And life conditions changed significantly then. You know, it was the emergence of the dominance of rational thought rather than in the first 3 systems. It's more a pre-rational dominance where people are driven by instincts and urges and basic needs. So at stage 4, we saw the emergence of logical thought and the famous Greek philosophers that we talk about. And then moving on from there, stage 5 you would be very familiar with because it's essentially the dominant paradigm globally at the moment. So it's a multiplistic way of thinking whereas in stage 4 there's generally a higher authority which dictates one right way to live, and we see that most obviously in religious belief systems in our society. But stage 5 brings a multiplistic way of thinking where people break out of the limitations of that rigid thought structure into a multiplistic, many options. So there are many different ways to do things, and it's a matter of experimenting and searching for the best way out of many options. And that's really the underlying thought pattern in our Western world at the moment, in what you would see as the sort of corporate, scientific, industrial world. And so, and you'll see those same patterns, play out at an individual level. So when people go through the wild stage, as a youngster, and they're just sort of living according to their urges and instincts, sooner or later that kind of wears them down, and they have to settle down, start thinking long term, and use the rational mind to figure out a path forward.
How to make a living.
Exactly, and that can then, so that's stage 4, and then that can develop into stage 5, a more sort of personal success driven corporate way of thinking. So that brings us up to the present moment, and what's interesting about Graves's work is that what he found was people move through this evolutionary process or personal growth process kind of like in a conga line. So you can imagine a line of people bopping forward, and some people are way up front, so they're ahead of where the mainstream is. You've got like a bell curve, I guess, and then people lagging behind down the back.
But it's inevitable. What you're essentially saying is this evolutionary process is inevitable. Everybody in time kind of ultimately kind of gets there, right?
Well, that looks like the long-term pattern, I mean, it can also go backwards, though, as I was saying right at the start. We've seen evidence of societies going backwards down these stages as well as forwards. And at an individual level, bearing in mind again that these are nested, so once you grow to a certain stage, you've still got all those other stages within you. The capacity to operate from them is within you. And depending on how your life conditions are, they might change suddenly, and you might have to spiral down or spiral up to operate from a different place. Yeah.
So spiraling up, what would cause this or encourage the spiraling up?
this relationship between the complexity of life conditions and our current coping capacity is really the key to understanding that. So as our life conditions become more complex, and in simple terms what that means is we can't solve problems like we used to, right?
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we then get drawn into this change process where we wake up one day and things just don't feel quite right. Everything was fine yesterday, but this morning I don't know what it is, but something's wrong. And that's the first sign that, okay, there's been a shift in life conditions and there's an adaptive process that needs to take place. And the more we get out of sync with our life conditions, so if these are life conditions here and they rise up to there and our coping capacity stays here, then the bigger that gap is, the more tension there is to create change. So if you imagine like an elastic band between those, and the higher that goes, sooner or later the band's going to snap back up. And what that feels like is that we get thrust into a change process whereby our old structures start to break down, and so I'm talking about like at a psychological level, but also biologically, you know, our networks, our neural networks and those sorts of things come to the point where they have to start breaking down in order to be free enough to reform into something new. And generally that comes through experiencing a period of uncertainty and perhaps chaos. You know, the kind of thing that's known as being in the alchemist's furnace, you know, in ancient philosophy. And then inevitably there's some kind of a breakthrough that happens where we break out of that chaos. We have insights which give us new ideas about how we can be and how we can think and how we can behave. And then often that's very energizing when it's like somebody opening a door after you've been trapped. And so we move through that energetic process by integrating, you know, those insights, and over time they're integrated to the point where we become stable again and we can match the complexity of life conditions. But humans like to stay the same. We don't like change, you know. So inevitably, because the universe seems to be always trending towards greater complexity, inevitably as soon as we get stable again, you know, the whole process repeats.
And the interesting thing about this is that it's applicable both in personal kind of terms, so you can kind of map your own kind of life development kind of process. It works in social kind of terms. It works probably in business terms, right?
Yeah.
I mean that any kind of aggregation of human beings kind of works through this kind of regular kind of process. And as you say, they can go up and down, or they can fail. A Kodak can't make it through.
That's right. Yeah. Another interesting aspect of Graves's work is that there was a consistent scope or a consistent range of change between the first 6 stages that he found, and we've spoken about up to including 5 at the moment. So maybe I'll just continue on up the scale a little bit.
Please.
So probably most people see that the world is kind of breaking down now. So that change process I just spoke about at an individual level is happening for us at a global level right now, where stage 5, this multiplistic, you know, corporate-minded, personal success-driven thinking, and the systems that it's created have started to have trouble coping with the level of complexity globally. And that's one of the main reasons for that is because of our interconnected technology. Which has created many more interactions than when those systems were designed. There was no internet, of course. So what we're seeing is the system's starting to fail. They can't cope with the amount of interaction that's going on. And this is evident in our economic system, political systems, those sorts of things. So we're being shunted into a change process at a species level, which is taking us to stage 6, which is a relativistic way of thinking. So whereas the multiplistic looked from one observer's position at many options, relativistic gives us the capacity to change positions. So I can imagine quite effectively what it's like to sit in your seat and look back at me, you know? And we start to get that capacity to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And the stage 6 is a very humanistic, network-centric way of living. And it's also a stage that draws us to look inside ourselves and start to go through a healing process.
Would you say in general, in social terms, that that's a derivative of the internet, that the internet is facilitating network kind of perspective?
Yeah, if you think of the internet as part of our life conditions, you go back 50, 60, 70 years and living in a world without the internet, it was a very different place. And now we can sit anywhere with a device and we can look right around the world and tap into what people are thinking, what they're doing, see photos and videos. Whereas 50, 60, 70 years ago, an individual in a house out here in Berkeley Springs.
But it's adding to complexity and options and other things.
Absolutely.
And making the network the explicit, if you will, the connectivity and the connections.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look through history at the speed of change, it's always been very connected with the speed of communication. So, the faster an idea can spread, the faster change can happen.
Right.
So there have been key milestones in history, like the invention of the printing press was a big one. I guess going back, the invention of written language, coming forward this way, the invention of electronic communication from starting with things like telephones and telegraph, and now the internet where we can communicate instantly. So the time scale between one stage emerging and the next stage emerging is being compressed.
Yep.
And that seems to be a pattern that's continued for as long as we know.
So what's above the network space?
We're probably likely to see the emergence of this network-centric humanistic value system or stage as the dominant paradigm globally, I'd say within just a few years from now. And that's going to bring us into a very interesting period of rapid change, because one of the characteristics of being fully networked globally is that everybody gets their 15 minutes of fame, right?
Yep.
And people who would never have influenced the world back 50 or 100 years ago
Have a blog.
Now have the opportunity to do so. And we're seeing this happening already, and particularly with terrorism, where a terrorist can cut someone's head off. And if that had happened 100 years ago, maybe 10, 15, 50 people might have seen it. But now it can be on YouTube and it can impact millions and millions of people instantly. It's like all of the previous stages of existence, which are still out there in different places, are all going to have their moment of exposure globally. Right. So it's going to create a super complex set of life conditions for us. Super complex.
We've got about 3 minutes to go here.
Yep.
So tell me, build it to last second, and then give me some sense of the numbers of people in each area, and then in the next segment we'll talk about the future.
Sure. So this rapidly increasing complexity that I just spoke about is going to cause a huge slingshot rise in consciousness beyond anything that we've ever seen. So there's no historical precedent that we know of for the amount of increase in consciousness we're going to see, within probably the next 20 to 30 years. And that will take us to a different set of stages. Graves referred to the first tier or first set and the second tier. So this moves us into the second tier to an individualistic stage, which is integrative, and it has more coping capacity than probably all of the previous 6 stages combined. It's off the scale. It's like a quantum leap in human consciousness. And it will see an integration of the operation of the left and right brain. So whereas we've been swinging between left and right in the previous stages, this 7th step is the first integrative step.
And what's the 8th step?
And then the 8th step, so the 7th step will be focused on, I believe, solving the major problems we have on the planet to ensure that our species survives. The 8th step then brings us back to a communal way of living, which is focused on bringing back a kind of stability globally. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll come back and we'll talk about the future and what the implications of all of this will be in our second segment. But Steve McDonald, thank you for being with us on PostScript today.
Thank you, John.
And thank you for being with us on PostScript. We come every month with interesting conversations coming to you from Berkeley Springs. And I'm John Petersen, and thank you.